Hello, wonderful people. I'm Jesse James Grazier. I recently received my PhD in pharmacology, and I'm making this YouTube channel to connect with people who are also interested in some of the same aspects of science that I am. So this video is called Chaos is the Hidden Architecture of Life. So I'm very familiar with chaos and models that try to look into the inherent structure of chaos because I'm actually from South Louisiana. And in South Louisiana, we have a lot of hurricanes that pass through, and they actually use something called Lorentz equations to predict the path of these hurricanes. So this is another way you can look at it is it's called the butterfly effect. So these models are very important in initial conditions to understand where the hurricane might go. Based on changing weather patterns and stuff, the hurricane can take many different possible paths. And it uses fractal geometry to map these paths based off the atmosphere. So basically, the inherent geometry of chaos is fractal. So it actually has a structure. Chaos actually has a structure. And we can also see this in quantum scoring. So if you take a golf ball or a tennis ball or something and you throw it around a room, it's just going to randomly bounce around like you can see in red right here. But then if you take a wave or a quantum wave, that waves are used to explain quantum particle behavior. So if you take a wave and run it through a similar trajectory as these red lines, because of the interference patterns that will occur and if two high waves meet or high amplitude meet, then that'll actually potentiate the wave. And if you have a low wave and a high wave come in contact with each other, then they'll cancel each other out. So because that happens, you actually have a pattern, an underlying pattern that forms. And I think that nature utilizes this disorganized pattern to group different things together and still have a structure. And that's why we see fractal structure throughout all of life and throughout many different things in the universe, because that's just how chaotic matter fits together and comes together. So about 40% of proteins and a lot of RNA and DNA nucleic acids have intrinsically disordered regions, and that's part of how they function. So they're naturally chaotic, and that's how they need to be so they function correctly. And one reason I think this is because of the inherent geometry, the inherent structure that occurs through these intrinsically disordered proteins, so that they can actually still maintain a structure, and it's actually a dynamic structure that can incorporate many different proteins, nucleic acids, and anything in the environment into the system, and it can reorganize. So it also gives the biological systems a computational capacity, and it will compute the information and turn it into some type of structure which will render the biological system with different fractal morphologies that we see throughout life in plants and animals. So why is this important for biology in terms of evolution? Well, you can look at protein dynamism and evolvability. So this is in terms of the protein's ability to evolve new functions. All proteins have a native function, so native activity. We're taught that in class, even in high school, I think, that proteins work through lock and key mechanisms. So the way they do work for the cell is by binding to things in a similar way that a lock and a key combine together. So a protein has grooves in it, and it can bind different things in a similar way that the grooves in a key go in a lock. But the thing about proteins is they're actually, as I mentioned before, a little disordered. So they can have promiscuous binding. They can bind to other things that aren't related to their function. And that's because of the intrinsic disordered regions that I talked about earlier. So that actually gives a buffer for the proteins to have mutations but still function properly. So you can have little changes that'll occur, and throughout life, many of our cells have many mutations, 10,000 mutations in some lineages of cells. So by the time you're about 60, so if you have that many mutations, how can your proteins deal with that and still function properly? And one way is through the intrinsic disordered regions being able to absorb those mutations. And even though it's changing a little bit, they can still take that because they're already disordered. You change it a little bit, it's still disordered, it's still working the same way. But that gives it a buffer to those mutations might go one way or the other to a promiscuous activity. So some mutations can actually have a positive effect on the protein. So because one of its promiscuous binding partners might make it work better. So that leaves room for a few mutations to occur until that one mutation that's necessary to make that protein work better actually has a chance to occur. So that's in terms of evolvability. It makes the proteins more susceptible from evolving through these mutations so that you can have many mutations occur and wait for that one mutation that actually has a positive effect on that protein and that cellular structure. So intrinsically disordered proteins are actually found everywhere outside the cell. You can see right here and inside the cell, forming something called bimolecular condensates. And that is a membraneless way that the cell can bring proteins together and form many different protein complexes. So it's a way for the cell to organize itself without an organelle or a membrane. So that's why they're called membraneless organelles. And they utilize those intrinsically disordered regions so that they're flexible enough to bind proteins together and maintain stability, but also a dynamic stability. So it's flexible. So this intrinsic disorder that we see in biological systems, this chaos, I think this is why we see so much fractal geometry in biological systems. In plants, you can see branching structures similar to the branching structures in the lungs. And I actually think it could be the fractal structures we see throughout all of the universe, because I think that this is just the inherent geometry of chaos. So when any matter or energy comes together, it's going to display this similar geometry. So the take home is that life and evolution exploits fractal geometry through disordered regions in proteins and nucleic acids like RNA and DNA, and that physics models in quantum physics could be used in biology so we can estimate how these systems are going to evolve and to know how they're going to change with drugs and different diets that different populations might have. So it can increase the efficacy of our treatments and hopefully make us more healthy humans. So thank you, wonderful people, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good one.